The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window, casting a warm glow over the granite countertops that felt as cold and sterile as Sophia's life. She sat at the breakfast table, her hands cradling a steaming cup of coffee, gazing blankly out into the manicured backyard. The silence was deafening. The only sounds were the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional rustling of the newspaper as her husband David turned its pages. David was the picture of professional perfection, immaculately dressed in a tailored suit, his wire-rimmed glasses perched neatly on his nose. His entire world revolved around work, and lately, it seemed like Sophia barely existed in that world. Her attempts at conversation were met with polite nods or monosyllabic replies, as if she were an afterthought in his meticulously planned schedule. "You'll be late for your meeting," she said softly, her voice breaking the silence. David glanced at his watch, gave a curt nod, and folded the newspaper. He planted a perfunctory kiss on her cheek before heading out the door, leaving behind the faint scent of his cologne. As the front door clicked shut, Sophia sighed, the weight of her unspoken words heavy in the empty house. The hours stretched ahead of her, an endless void filled with errands, tidying in the same monotonous routine she'd followed for years. Once, Sophia had dreams. She had been passionate about art, spending hours in her studio painting vibrant canvases that spoke of life and love. But marriage had dulled her spark. The art supplies were now tucked away in a forgotten corner of the garage, collecting dust. Sophia slid on her coat and grabbed her purse, deciding to break the monotony with a walk. As she strolled through the bustling streets of the city, she found herself drawn to a small coffee shop she'd passed many times, but never entered. Something about its cozy charm, the chalkboard menu with handwritten specials, the scent of freshly brewed coffee wafting out the door, called to her. Inside, the atmosphere was warm and inviting. A soft murmur of conversation filled the air, mingling with the hiss of the espresso machine. Sophia joined the line, her eyes scanning the menu, though she already knew she'd order her usual black coffee. Her gaze wandered to the barista behind the counter, a young man with a mop of dark hair and a confident smile that seemed to light up the room. When it was her turn, she stepped forward hesitantly. "Good morning," he said, his voice smooth and warm. "What can I get for you?" "Just a black coffee, please," Sophia replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Coming right up," he said, his smile never wavering. As he prepared her drink, he glanced at her, his eyes sparkling with curiosity. "You're new here, aren't you?" She nodded, feeling a blush creep up her cheeks. "First time." "Well, welcome. I'm Liam," he said, setting the coffee on the counter. "And the first cup's on me?" Sophia blinked in surprise. "Oh, I couldn't." "It's on the house," he insisted, leaning closer with a playful grin. "Consider it a warm welcome." She smiled despite herself, the small gesture brightening her otherwise drab day. "Thank you. That's very kind." As she turned to leave, she couldn't help but notice the way Liam watched her, as if trying to figure out her story. It was unsettling, yet oddly flattering. For the first time in months, maybe years, she felt seen. The following day, Sophia found herself back at the coffee shop, her steps quickening as she approached the door. She told herself it was just for the coffee. She'd always been a fan of trying new blends, but deep down she knew it was more than that. Something about Liam's energy had sparked a curiosity she couldn't ignore. When she entered, his face lit up with recognition. "Back so soon?" he teased. Sophia chuckled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "The coffee was good." "Ah, to hear it." "Same as yesterday?" She nodded, and as he prepared her drink, they chatted briefly. She learned that Liam was 25, studying graphic design, and worked at the cafe part-time to pay for school. His enthusiasm for life was infectious, and Sophia found herself smiling more in those few minutes than she had in days. "You've got an artist's eye," Liam said suddenly, gesturing to the sketchbook she had absent-mindedly pulled from her bag. "Do you draw?" "Not really. I used to paint," she admitted, her tone tinged with regret. "It's been a long time." "Why'd you stop?" he asked, his brow furrowing. Sophia hesitated, unsure how to explain the slow erosion of her passion. "Life got in the way, I guess." Liam leaned on the counter, his gaze unwavering. "Maybe it's time to start again." His words lingered with her long after she left the cafe. That night, as she sat in the dim light of her living room, Sophia thought about the young barista who spoke so freely about pursuing dreams. She glanced at the corner where her art supplies were hidden, a faint spark flickering in her chest. The third time she visited the cafe, Liam greeted her with an easy smile and an offhand comment that caught her off guard. "You look different today," he said, his eyes scanning her face. "Happier." Sophia blinked, startled. "Do I?" "Yeah," he said, handing her the coffee. "Like someone who's starting to come alive again." The word struck a chord deep within her, stirring something she couldn't quite name. She spent the rest of the day replaying them in her mind, wondering why they resonated so strongly. At home, David was as detached as ever, immersed in his laptop as they ate dinner in near silence. Sophia watched him, feeling a pang of guilt for the flutter of excitement she felt around Liam. Then, as she cleared the table and glanced at the clock, she realized something startling. She didn't want to feel guilty. For the first time in years, she was beginning to rediscover a part of herself she thought was lost. And Liam was the reason why. The late morning sunlight streamed through the cafe's windows, dancing on the polished wooden tables and casting warm shadows across the room. The air buzzed with soft conversation, the aroma of fresh coffee mingling with the faint scent of baked goods. Sophia walked in, the small bell above the door announcing her arrival. Liam looked up from behind the counter, his face breaking into a smile that seemed to break through the entire space. "Good morning," he said, his tone carrying a familiar warmth. "Your usual?" Sophia smiled back, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Yes, please." As he moved to prepare her coffee, Sophia glanced around, noticing how comfortable she felt here. It had become her sanctuary, a small escape from the monotony of her life. Over the past few weeks, her visits to the cafe had grown more frequent, and her conversations with Liam had become the highlight of her day. When he handed her the coffee, their fingers brushed briefly, a seemingly innocent moment that sent a spark through her. She glanced up, and their eyes met. There was something unspoken in his gaze, curiosity, admiration, and something else she couldn't quite place. "You seem happier these days," Liam said, leaning casually against the counter. "Am I right?" Sophia hesitated, unsure how to answer. Was she happier, or was it just that she felt alive when she was here talking to him? "I guess so," she said softly. "You have a way of brightening people's days." He chuckled, the sound warm and genuine. "Just doing my job. But with you, I don't know. You got this energy about you. It's like you're on the edge of something, ready to jump." The comment lingered in the air, and Sophia felt her heart race. She couldn't deny the magnetic pull she felt toward him, but she reminded herself that it was nothing more than harmless admiration. Still, the way he spoke to her, the way he looked at her, it was as if he saw something in her that she hadn't seen in herself for years. Later that week, Sophia found herself back at the cafe, seated at a small table near the window. She had brought her sketchbook this time, hoping to rediscover the part of her that once loved to create. As she sketched, the pencil gliding across the page, she felt a strange mix of excitement and nervousness. It had been so long since she'd allowed herself to do this. "Wow," Liam's voice broke through her concentration. She looked up to see him standing there, holding a coffee cup and wearing an expression of genuine admiration. "You're really good." Sophia blushed, closing the sketchbook instinctively. "It's nothing, just doodles." "Don't sell yourself short," he said, sliding into the seat across from her without waiting for an invitation. "You've got talent." His presence was both comforting and disarming. They sat there for a moment, the hum of the cafe surrounding them. Liam leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. Would you stop?" he asked, his tone soft but insistent. Sophia hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of the closed sketchbook. Life got busy, marriage, responsibilities. It just didn't feel important anymore. "Does it feel important now?" he asked, his gaze unwavering. She looked at him, the weight of his question sinking in. "Maybe," she admitted. "I don't know." Liam smiled, leaning back in his chair. "Well, I think you should keep at it. The world could use more beauty." Sophia's chest tightened at his words. No one had spoken to her like this in years, as if she were someone worth noticing, someone with potential. As their conversation continued, she felt a warmth spreading through her, a mix of gratitude, admiration, and something deeper, something dangerous. A week later, Sophia and Liam's paths crossed again, this time outside the cafe. She had just finished grocery shopping when she spotted him across the street, his easy gait and confident demeanor immediately recognizable. He saw her too, his face lighting up as he jogged over. "Hey, fancy meeting you here," he said, his voice laced with genuine delight. "Hi," she replied, surprised by how happy she was to see him. "What brings you to this part of town?" "Just running errands," he said, glancing at the bags in her hands. "Need help with those?" Before she could protest, he grabbed a few bags, his casual confidence making it impossible to refuse. They walked together to her car, chatting easily about everything and nothing. When they reached her vehicle, Liam set the bags in the trunk and turned to face her. "Thanks for the help," Sophia said, her smile lingering longer than usual. "Anytime," he replied, his tone carrying a hint of something more. "You know, I don't just make coffee. If you ever want to grab lunch or something, I'm around." The offer hung in the air, and Sophia felt her heart skip a beat. It was an innocent suggestion, but the look in his eyes made it clear that it meant more than that. She hesitated, torn between the thrill of his attention and the reality of her life. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Liam smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent shivers down her spine. "You know where to find me." The next day, Sophia found herself staring at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. She had spent far too long getting ready, choosing a dress that she hadn't worn in years, and applying makeup with a precision that felt both foreign and exhilarating. Her husband, David, was already at work, oblivious to her plans for the day. As she walked into the cafe, Liam looked up from behind the counter, his eyes widening slightly as he took in her appearance. "Wow," he said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "You look amazing." "Thank you," she replied, her cheeks flushing with warmth. They sat together at a corner table, their conversation flowing effortlessly. Sophia felt a sense of freedom she hadn't experienced in years, as if she were shedding the weight of her everyday life, if only for a moment. Liam was attentive, his gaze never straying far from hers, and his words carried a charm that made her feel alive. As they finished their lunch, Liam leaned forward, his expression serious. "Sophia, can I ask you something?" "Of course," she said, her heart racing. "Are you happy?" he asked, his voice soft but direct. The question caught her off guard. She looked down at her hands, her mind racing. Was she happy? The answer should have been simple, but it wasn't. I don't know, she admitted, her voice trembling. Liam reached across the table, his hand brushing hers gently. "You deserve to be," he said, his eyes filled with sincerity. "Whatever that looks like for you, you deserve it." Sophia felt a lump form in her throat. His words were both comforting and unsettling, forcing her to confront the truths she had been avoiding. As they left the cafe, Liam walked her to her car, their conversation lingering in the air like an unspoken promise. "Thank you," she said softly as she opened the car door, "for everything." Liam smiled, his eyes holding hers for a moment longer than necessary. "Any time." That night, as Sophia lay in bed next to David, she stared at the ceiling, her mind replaying the day's events. She felt a mix of exhilaration and guilt, her emotions swirling in a storm of confusion. Liam had awakened something in her, a spark she hadn't felt in years. But what did it mean? And where would it lead? The answers eluded her, but one thing was clear. She couldn't ignore the pull she felt toward him. For better or worse, her life was no longer the same. The late morning sunlight streamed through the cafe's windows, dancing on the polished wooden tables and casting warm shadows across the room. The air buzzed with soft conversation, the aroma of fresh coffee mingling with the faint scent of baked goods. Sophia walked in, the small bell above the door announcing her arrival. Liam looked up from behind the counter, his face breaking into a smile that seemed to brighten the entire space. "Good morning," he said, his tone carrying a familiar warmth. "Your usual?" Sophia smiled back, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Yes, please." As he moved to prepare her coffee, Sophia glanced around, noticing how comfortable she felt here. It had become her sanctuary, a small escape from the monotony of her life. Over the past few weeks, her visits to the cafe had grown more frequent, and her conversations with Liam had become the highlight of her day. When he handed her the coffee, their fingers brushed briefly, a seemingly innocent moment that sent a spark through her. She glanced up, and their eyes met. There was something unspoken in his gaze. Curiosity, admiration, and something else she couldn't quite place. "You seem happier these days," Liam said, leaning casually against the counter. "Am I right?" Sophia hesitated, unsure how to answer. Was she happier? Or was it just that she felt alive when she was here talking to him? "I guess so," she said softly. "You have a way of brightening people's days." He chuckled, the sound warm and genuine. "Just doing my job. But with you, I don't know, you've got this energy about you. It's like you're on the edge of something, ready to jump." The comment lingered in the air, and Sophia felt her heart race. She couldn't deny the magnetic pull she felt toward him, but she reminded herself that it was nothing more than harmless admiration. Still, the way he spoke to her, the way he looked at her, it was as if he saw something in her that she hadn't seen in herself for years. Later that week, Sophia found herself back at the cafe, seated at a small table near the window. She had brought her sketchbook this time, hoping to rediscover the part of her that once loved to create. As she sketched, the pencil gliding across the page, she felt a strange mix of excitement and nervousness. It had been so long since she'd allowed herself to do this. "Wow!" Liam's voice broke through her concentration. She looked up to see him standing there, holding a coffee cup and wearing an expression of genuine admiration. "You're really good." Sophia blushed, closing the sketchbook instinctively. "It's nothing, just doodles." "Don't sell yourself short," he said, sliding into the seat across from her without waiting for an invitation. "You've got talent." His presence was both comforting and disarming. They sat there for a moment, the hume of the cafe surrounding them. Liam leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "Would you stop?" he asked, his tone soft but insistent. Sophia hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of the closed sketchbook. Life got busy, marriage, responsibilities. It just didn't feel important anymore. "Does it feel important now?" he asked, his gaze unwavering. She looked at him, the weight of his question sinking in. "Maybe," she admitted. "I don't know." Liam smiled, leaning back in his chair. "Well, I think you should keep at it. The world could use more beauty." Sophia's chest tightened at his words. No one had spoken to her like this in years, as if she were someone worth noticing, someone with potential. As their conversation continued, she felt a warmth spreading through her, a mix of gratitude, admiration, and something deeper, something dangerous. A week later, Sophia and Liam's paths crossed again, this time outside the cafe. She had just finished grocery shopping when she spotted him across the street, his easy gait and confident demeanor immediately recognizable. He saw her too, his face lighting up as he jogged over. "Hey, fancy meeting you here," he said, his voice laced with genuine delight. "Hi," she replied, surprised by how happy she was to see him. "What brings you to this part of town?" "Just running errands," he said, glancing at the bags in her hands. "Need help with those?" Before she could protest, he grabbed a few bags, his casual confidence making it impossible to refuse. They walked together to her car, chatting easily about everything and nothing. When they reached her vehicle, Liam set the bags in the trunk and turned to face her. "Thanks for the help," Sophia said, her smile lingering longer than usual. "Any time," he replied, his tone carrying a hint of something more. "You know, I don't just make coffee. If you ever want to grab lunch or something, I'm around." The offer hung in the air, and Sophia felt her heart skip a beat. It was an innocent suggestion, but the look in his eyes made it clear that it meant more than that. She hesitated, torn between the thrill of his attention and the reality of her life. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Liam smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent shivers down her spine. "You know where to find me." The next day, Sophia found herself staring at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. She had spent far too long getting ready, choosing a dress that she hadn't worn in years, and applying makeup with a precision that felt both foreign and exhilarating. Her husband, David, was already at work, oblivious to her plans for the day. As she walked into the cafe, Liam looked up from behind the counter, his eyes widening slightly as he took in her appearance. "Wow," he said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "You look amazing." "Thank you," she replied, her cheeks flushing with warmth. They sat together at a corner table, their conversation flowing effortlessly. Sophia felt a sense of freedom she hadn't experienced in years, as if she were shedding the weight of her everyday life, if only for a moment. Liam was attentive, his gaze never straying far from hers, and his words carried a charm that made her feel alive. As they finished their lunch, Liam leaned forward, his expression serious. "Sophia, um, can I ask you something?" "Of course," she said, her heart racing. "Are you happy?" he asked, his voice soft but direct. The question caught her off guard. She looked down at her hands, her mind racing. Was she happy? The answer should have been simple, but it wasn't. I don't know," she admitted, her voice trembling. Liam reached across the table, his hand brushing hers gently. "You deserve to be," he said, his eyes filled with sincerity. "Whatever that looks like for you, you deserve it." Sophia felt a lump form in her throat. His words were both comforting and unsettling, forcing her to confront the truth she had been avoiding. As they left the cafe, Liam walked her to her car, their conversation lingering in the air like an unspoken promise. "Thank you," she said softly as she opened the car door, "for everything." Liam smiled, his eyes holding hers for a moment longer than necessary. "Anytime." That night, as Sophia lay in bed next to David, she stared at the ceiling, her mind replaying the day's events. She felt a mix of exhilaration and guilt, her emotions swirling in a storm of confusion. Liam had awakened something in her, a spark she hadn't felt in years. But what did it mean? And where would it lead? The answers eluded her, but one thing was clear. She couldn't ignore the pull she felt toward him. For better or worse, her life was no longer the same. The days that followed the kiss were a whirlwind of emotions for Sophia. Her mind was a battlefield, caught between the lingering warmth of Liam's touch and the cold, gnawing guilt that haunted her every interaction with David. She told herself it was a one-time mistake, a moment of weakness. But deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. She found herself avoiding Liam for a few days, skipping her usual visits to the cafe and ignoring the small ache in her chest that came with it. She needed to think, to figure out what she wanted, or rather, what she was willing to risk. But Liam, it seemed, was unwilling to be ignored. One afternoon, as Sophia exited the grocery store, she saw him leaning against his car in the parking lot. He spotted her immediately and waved, his smile tentative but hopeful. Sophia froze, her heart pounding as he walked toward her. "You've been avoiding me," he said, his tone soft but direct. Sophia glanced around nervously, her fingers tightening on the grocery bag handles. "I've just been busy." "Busy thinking about us?" he asked, his eyes searching hers. Sophia's breath hitched. There was no point denying it. She sighed, lowering her gaze. "Liam, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know what we're doing." He stepped closer, his voice gentle but insistent. "I know what I'm doing. I'm falling for you, Sophia." His words hit her like a freight train, their weight sinking into her chest. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and longing. "You shouldn't say things like that." "Why not?" he asked, his gaze unwavering. "It's the truth, and I think you feel the same." Sophia shook her head, trying to summon the strength to walk away. "This isn't fair to you, or to David." "Fairness doesn't always matter," Liam said, his voice steady. "Sometimes it's about what's real, and this, whatever this is between us, it feels real." Sophia opened her mouth to protest, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she felt the sting of tears in her eyes, her emotions too tangled to untangle here in a parking lot. Liam reached out, his hand brushing hers, and the touch sent a jolt through her. "Let me take you somewhere," he said suddenly. "No expectations, no pressure, just somewhere we can talk." Sophia hesitated, her heart warring with her mind. But as she looked into Liam's eyes, she saw something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Against her better judgment, she nodded. Liam drove them to a quiet park on the outskirts of the city, a secluded spot he said he visited when he needed to think. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and freshly fallen leaves. They walked along a narrow trail, the crunch of their footsteps the only sound. When they reached a clearing with a small bench overlooking a pond, Liam stopped. He turned to Sophia, his expression earnest. "I didn't mean to complicate your life," he said, "but I can't pretend that what I feel for you isn't real." Sophia sat down on the bench, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I don't know what to do, Liam. I've been married to David for so long. It's not perfect, but it's comfortable." "Comfortable isn't the same as happy," Liam said, sitting beside her. "You deserve to be happy, Sophia, and if David can't see that, then maybe he doesn't deserve you." His words stung, because they carried a truth she had tried to ignore. She stared at the pond, her reflection distorted by the ripples on the water's surface. What if this is just a fantasy? What if it doesn't last? "Then at least you'll know you tried," Liam said, his voice firm. "But you can't keep living your life for someone else. You have to decide what you want." Sophia turned to him, tears brimming in her eyes. "And what if I want both? What if I don't want to lose him, but I can't let go of you?" Liam reached out, his hand resting on hers. "Then you have to be honest with yourself about what you need, about who you are." His touch was steady, grounding her in a way she didn't expect. For a moment, they sat there in silence, the weight of their choices pressing down on them. Then, almost instinctively, Sophia leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder. He wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. "I don't have all the answers," Liam said softly, "but I know that being with you feels right, and I think you feel it too." Sophia closed her eyes, allowing herself to sink into the warmth of his embrace. For the first time in years, she felt safe. Not in the predictable, unchanging way David made her feel, but in a way that was alive and real. Their relationship deepened after that night. Sophia tried to compartmentalize, telling herself that what she had with Liam didn't have to affect her marriage. But the truth was, it already had. She found herself pulling away from David, her patience for his detached demeanor wearing thin. One evening, as David worked late yet again, Sophia found herself at Liam's apartment. It was a modest space, filled with personal touches that reflected his creative spirit, sketches pinned to the walls, books stacked haphazardly on shelves, and the faint smell of coffee lingering in the air. They sat on the couch, a bottle of wine between them, the conversation flowing as easily as it always did. But this time, there was an unspoken tension, a current pulling them closer. "You're incredible, you know that?" Liam said suddenly, his gaze locked on hers. "The way you think, the way you see the world, it's beautiful." Sophia felt her cheeks flush, her heart pounding in her chest. "I don't feel beautiful most days." "Well, you are," he said, his voice firm. "And if David can't see that, then he's a fool." His words hung in the air, and Sophia felt the distance between them shrink. She leaned forward, her breath catching as Liam cupped her face in his hands. Their lips met in a kiss that was both tender and desperate, a collision of longing and restraint. As the kiss deepened, Sophia felt herself letting go of the guilt, the fear, the hesitation. In that moment, all that mattered was Liam. The way he made her feel, the way he saw her, the way he cared. When they finally pulled apart, Liam rested his forehead against hers, his breathing unsteady. "You don't have to decide anything right now," he said, "but I need you to know I'm here for you, always." Sophia nodded, her emotions too raw to put into words. She stayed in his arms, the weight of her choices temporarily lifted by the warmth of his embrace. That night, as she lay in bed beside David, Sophia stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. She knew she was walking a dangerous path, one that could destroy everything she had built. But for the first time in years, she felt alive, and she wasn't sure she was ready to let that go. Sophia sat at the edge of her bed, her hands trembling slightly as she fastened her earrings. The air in the room was heavy, charged with anticipation and guilt. She glanced at the clock. David had just left for the office, his goodbye kiss brief and perfunctory as always. Today was different. Today she wasn't just visiting Liam. She was making a choice. For the past week, her meetings with Liam had taken on a new intensity. Their walks, their conversations, even their shared silences had begun to blur the boundaries of what was appropriate. And then there was the kiss. The one in his apartment, the one that had shattered the fragile barrier she'd tried to maintain. It was no longer a question of if, it was a question of when. Sophia grabbed her purse and stepped out into the crisp morning air. As she drove toward Liam's apartment, her heart raced, each mile bringing her closer to a decision she couldn't take back. Liam greeted her at the door, his expression soft but tinged with concern. "You came," he said, stepping aside to let her in. "I told you I would," Sophia replied, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. His apartment felt different today, warmer, more intimate. The sunlight streaming through the windows bathed the room in a golden glow, casting soft shadows on the walls. Liam had set 2 mugs of coffee on the table, the faint aroma filling the space. They sat across from each other, the silence between them heavy, but not uncomfortable. Liam reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low. Sophia nodded, though she wasn't sure if it was true. "I don't know how to feel right now," she admitted. "I'm scared, but I'm also excited." Liam finished for her, his eyes searching hers. She looked down at their hands, her fingers intertwining with his. "I haven't felt this way in years," she whispered, "and that terrifies me." Liam stood gently pulling her to her feet. He wrapped his arms around her, his embrace firm yet tender. "You don't have to be scared," he said. "We'll take this one step at a time. No pressure, no expectations. Sophia closed her eyes, letting herself sink into his warmth. For the first time in a long time, she felt like someone was holding her together instead of pulling her apart. The hours that followed were a blur of emotions: passion, vulnerability, and a sense of freedom that Sophia hadn't felt in years. Liam's touch was gentle, yet insistent, his every movement filled with a reverence that left her breathless. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional, a connection that went beyond anything she had ever experienced. As they lay together in the quiet aftermath, the weight of what they had done began to settle in. Sophia stared at the ceiling, her thoughts racing. She had crossed a line, one that couldn't be undone, but instead of regret, she felt a strange sense of clarity. Liam propped himself up on one elbow, his gaze soft as he studied her. "What are you thinking?" he asked. Sophia turned to him, her expression conflicted. "That I don't know how to go back to my life after this." "You don't have to," Liam said, his voice firm but gentle. "You deserve more than just going through the motions, Sophia. You deserve to be happy." His words sent a pang through her chest. She wanted to believe him, to let herself imagine a life where she didn't feel trapped by routine and obligation. But the reality of her marriage, her life with David, loomed large in the background. Over the next few weeks, Sophia and Liam's relationship deepened. Their stolen moments together became the highlight of her days, a secret world where she could be herself without fear of judgment. Liam encouraged her to paint again, even setting up a small corner of his apartment with supplies so she could work while they spent time together. For the first time in years, Sophia felt alive. Her paintings were vibrant and full of emotion, reflecting the whirlwind of feelings she was experiencing. Liam watched her work with a mix of admiration and pride, his presence a constant source of inspiration. But the double life was taking its toll. At home, Sophia found it harder to engage with David. His obliviousness to her inner turmoil only fueled her frustration. He didn't question her late nights or her increased absences, chalking it up to her needing space. But Sophia could feel the cracks in their marriage widening, the distance between them growing insurmountable. One evening, as they sat across from each other at the dinner table, David looked up from his plate. "You've been different lately," he said, his tone casual but laced with curiosity. Sophia's heart skipped a beat. "Different how?" she asked, keeping her voice even. "I don't know," he replied, studying her. "Happier, maybe, or distracted. Is everything okay?" Sophia forced a smile, her stomach twisting with guilt. "I'm fine," she said, "just trying to find myself again." David nodded, seemingly satisfied with her answer. But as the conversation shifted, Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that he was beginning to notice the cracks in her facade. The close calls didn't end there. One afternoon, while leaving Liam's apartment, Sophia ran into a neighbor who recognized her from the neighborhood. The woman's raised eyebrow and polite smile sent a chill down Sophia's spine, and she spent the rest of the day on edge, wondering if David would hear about it. The guilt began to weigh heavier with each passing day. Liam noticed the change in her demeanor, his concern evident. One evening, as they sat on his couch, he took her hand in his. "Sophia, talk to me," he said, his voice soft. "What's going on?" She sighed, her eyes brimming with tears. "I don't know how to do this, Liam. I feel like I'm living two lives, and it's tearing me apart." Liam pulled her into his arms, his embrace steadying her. "You don't have to figure it all out right now," he said. "But whatever you decide, I'm here. I'm always be here." His words were a comfort, but they also heightened the pressure Sophia felt. She couldn't keep lying to David, and she couldn't keep hurting Liam by being unable to commit fully to him. Something had to give. One night, as Sophia sat in her car outside her house, she made a decision. She needed to confront the reality of her situation, to face the consequences of her choices. Whether it meant ending things with Liam or leaving her marriage, she couldn't keep living in limbo. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out of the car and walked into the house. David was in his office as usual, the glow of his laptop illuminating his face. Sophia hesitated in the doorway, her heart pounding. "David," she said, her voice trembling. He looked up, his expression surprised. "What's wrong?" Sophia took a deep breath, the weight of her words pressing down on her. "We need to talk." Sophia's heart pounded as she stepped out of her car, the late morning sun warming her skin but doing little to ease the chill of her nerves. Liam had sent her a simple text earlier that morning, "Come over, we need to talk." It wasn't a demand, it never was with him, but she felt the gravity in his words, the subtle plea hidden beneath them. She hesitated at his door, her hand hovering over the bell. Part of her wanted to turn around, to retreat to the safety of her predictable life, but safety, she had realized, had long since lost its comfort. With a steadying breath, she pressed the button. The door opened almost immediately. Liam standing there in a t-shirt and jeans, his casual appearance a stark contrast to the intensity in his eyes. "Hey," he said, his voice soft but steady. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "I wasn't either," Sophia admitted, stepping inside. The familiar scent of his apartment, coffee, faint traces of paint, and something uniquely him, wrapped around her like a blanket. They sat together on his couch, the tension in the room palpable. Liam was the first to speak. "I've been thinking a lot about us," he began, his gaze fixed on her. "About what this is, what it could be." Sophia's breath caught. She knew this moment had been coming, but hearing it aloud made it real in a way she wasn't prepared for. "And?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know how complicated this is for you," Liam said, reaching for her hand. His fingers brushed hers, a small gesture that sent a jolt through her. "But I also know that what I feel for you is real, and I know you feel it too." Sophia's eyes filled with tears, her emotions swirling in a chaotic storm. "I do," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But it doesn't make it any easier." Liam leaned closer, his voice gentle but insistent. "I'm not asking for easy. I'm asking for honest. Can you give me that?" Sophia looked at him, her walls crumbling under the weight of his sincerity. "Yes," she said, the word escaping her lips before she could think to stop it. Their kiss that followed was inevitable, the culmination of weeks of unspoken longing and stolen glances. It was slow and tender at first, a tentative crossing of a line they both knew couldn't be uncrossed. But as the kiss deepened, so did their connection, the barriers between them dissolving like mist. Liam pulled away first, his forehead resting against hers as they both caught their breath. "We don't have to rush this," he said, his voice low and steady. "I don't want you to feel pressured." "I don't," Sophia replied, surprising herself with the certainty in her tone. "I want this." Her words ignited something in him, and their lips met again, more urgently this time. As they moved together, the outside world faded away, leaving only the warmth of their connection and the unspoken promises in their embrace. The hours they spent together felt like a dream, a bubble of stolen moments that seemed too fragile to exist in the real world. Liam's touch was reverent, his attention unwavering, and, for the first time in years, Sophia felt truly seen. It wasn't just passion. It was something deeper, something that filled the empty spaces in her heart. But reality couldn't be ignored forever. As the afternoon sun began to wane, Sophia sat on the edge of his bed, her gaze distant. "What are you thinking?" Liam asked, sitting beside her. "That this feels right," she said, her voice tinged with both wonder and guilt. "But it's also the most selfish thing I've ever done." Liam reached for her hand, his grip firm and grounding. "It's not selfish to want to be happy, Sophia. You deserve that." At what cost?" she whispered, her tears threatening to spill over. "What happens when David finds out? What happens if we don't work?" "We will," Liam said with quiet conviction. "But even if we don't, at least you'll know you chose yourself, that you didn't just settle for a life that doesn't make you happy." His words stayed with her long after she left his apartment, her heart heavy, but her resolve stronger than it had been in years. At home, Sophia found it harder than ever to face David. He was oblivious, as always, buried in work and his own world. But the weight of her secret pressed down on her, the guilt manifesting in small, sharp pangs that struck at unexpected moments. One evening, as they sat across from each other at the dinner table, David looked up from his plate. "You've been different lately," he said, his tone casual but probing. "Happier, maybe, or distracted. Is everything okay?" Sophia froze, her fork hovering midair. "I'm fine," she said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just trying to focus on myself more, you know? Painting again, things like that." David nodded, seemingly satisfied with her answer. "That's good. You've always been happier when you're creating." His comment stung in its simplicity, a reminder of the man he used to be, the man who had noticed her passions and supported her dreams. But that man felt like a distant memory, replaced by someone who seemed content to let her fade into the background of his life. The affair continued, each stolen moment with Liam adding fuel to the fire of her conflicted emotions. They met at his apartment, at the park, even at her favorite art gallery, where Liam surprised her with tickets to a private exhibit. He had a way of making her feel special, cherished, in ways that David hadn't in years. But with each high came the inevitable low. The guilt gnawed at her, a constant reminder of the life she was risking. And yet, she couldn't bring herself to stop. Liam was her escape, her reminder of what it felt like to be alive. One afternoon, as she left Liam's apartment, she ran into his neighbor, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a knowing smile. "Nice to see you again," the woman said, her tone polite but laced with curiosity. Sophia forced a smile, her heart racing. "You too." As she hurried to her car, she couldn't shake the feeling that the woman knew more than she let on. The encounter left her on edge, the fear of discovery looming larger than ever. That night, Sophia lay in bed beside David, staring at the ceiling. the weight of her choices pressed down on her, the duality of her life becoming harder to maintain. She knew she couldn't keep this up, couldn't keep lying to herself, to David, and to Liam. Something had to give. Sophia felt the tension in her life stretching like a taut wire, threatening to snap at any moment. The duality of her existence was taking its toll, and the weight of her choices pressed down heavier each day. At home, David seemed oblivious, locked in his predictable routine. But she couldn't escape the feeling that her carefully constructed facade was beginning to crack. One evening, as Sophia stood at the kitchen counter preparing dinner, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen to see Liam's name. Her heart quickened, and she hesitated before opening the message. Miss you. Can we talk later? Sophia's fingers hovered over the keyboard. She quickly typed a reply before she could second-guess herself. I'll call you after dinner. As she set the phone down, David walked into the kitchen, startling her. Everything okay? He asked, his eyes flickering to her phone. Yeah, Sophia said quickly, turning back to the chopping board. Just a friend checking in. David nodded absently, but Sophia couldn't shake the unease that prickled at her skin. She knew she was being careless, but the pull toward Liam was stronger than her fear. Later that night, with David asleep in his office chair, Sophia stepped outside onto the porch, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. She dialed Liam's number, her heart racing as it rang. Hey! His voice came through, warm and steady. Hi, she said, her voice soft. I wasn't sure if I should call. I'm glad you did, Liam said. I've been thinking about you all day. Sophia leaned against the porch railing, the cool night air brushing against her skin. I've been thinking about you too, she admitted. But it's getting harder, Liam. I feel like I'm going to slip up. Then stop hiding, Liam said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. Be honest, with David, with yourself. You don't have to keep living like this. Sophie's throat tightened. I don't know if I'm ready for that. I don't know if I'll ever be ready. Liam was silent for a moment. When he spoke again, his tone was gentle but firm. You deserve to be happy, Sophia, but you have to decide what that looks like. I can't make the choice for you. His words stayed with her long after they ended the call, the truth in them impossible to ignore. The following week, Sophia and Liam met at the park, their usual refuge from prying eyes. The trees had turned golden with the arrival of autumn, their leaves crunching beneath Sophia's feet as she walked toward him. Liam greeted her with a soft smile, his arms pulling her into a warm embrace. You've been quiet, he said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Just thinking, she replied, her voice heavy with emotion. About us? He asked, his tone gentle but probing. Sophia nodded, her eyes meeting his. Liam, I don't know how to do this. I can't imagine my life without you, but I can't just walk away from everything I've built with David. Liam sighed, his hands resting on her shoulders. I'm not asking you to make a decision right this second. But you can't keep living in limbo, Sophia. It's not fair to any of us. Sophia's chest tightened, tears brimming in her eyes. I know, she whispered. I know. The cracks in Sophia's facade became harder to conceal. One evening, as she stood in the living room folding laundry, David approached her with an unusual seriousness. Is there something going on? He asked, his voice calm but tinged with concern. Sophia's hands stilled, her heart pounding. What do you mean? She asked, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "You've been distant," David said, his eyes searching hers. "I feel like I don't know what's going on with you anymore." Spotted, her mind racing. "I've just been overwhelmed, trying to figure things out." David stepped closer, his expression softening. "You can talk to me, you know. Whatever it is, we can work through it." His words struck a chord, a reminder of the man he used to be, the man who had once been her confidant, her partner. But the distance between them now felt insurmountable, and Sophia couldn't bring herself to bridge the gap. "I'll try," she said softly, turning away before he could see the tears in her eyes. Sophia's resolve wavered as her connection with Liam deepened. They spent more time together, their stolen moments filled with laughter, passion, and a sense of freedom she couldn't find anywhere else. But with each passing day, the weight of her secret grew heavier. One evening, as they sat together in Liam's apartment, Sophia confided her fears. "I feel like I'm living two lives," she said, her voice trembling, "and I'm scared of losing both." Liam took her hand, his gaze steady. "You won't lose me," he said. "No matter what happens, I'm here. But you have to decide what you want, Sophia. You can't keep doing this to yourself." Sophia nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I don't know how to choose," she admitted. "I don't know if I can." Liam pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. "You're stronger than you think," he said, "and whatever you decide, I'll be here to support you." His words offered comfort, but they also heightened the urgency of her dilemma. Sophia knew she couldn't continue living in limbo. Something had to give. The turning point came on a rainy Saturday afternoon. Sophia and Liam were at the art gallery, admiring a new exhibit. As they stood before a vibrant painting, Liam turned to her, his expression serious. "You should be doing this," he said, gesturing to the artwork. "Creating, living, not just existing." Sophia looked at him, her chest tightening. "Liam, I don't even know who I am anymore." "Then find out," he said, his voice firm but kind, "and let me help you." His words resonated deeply, a spark igniting within her. For the first time, Sophia felt a glimmer of clarity, a realization that she couldn't keep living in the shadows of her own life. That night, as she sat in her car outside her house, Sophia made a decision. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she couldn't keep running from it. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out of the car and walked inside. David was in the living room, reading the paper. He looked up as she entered, his expression curious. "Sophia," he said, setting the paper down. "Everything okay?" She hesitated, her heart pounding. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. David's brow furrowed, but he nodded. "Okay," he said. "What's going on?" Sophia sat down across from him, the weight of her choice pressing down on her. "There's something I need to tell you," she began, her voice trembling. "Something I've been keeping from you." The room seemed to shrink around Sophia as she sat across from David, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her heart pounded, each beat echoing in her ears. David leaned forward slightly, his brows knitted in concern, but his expression was calm. "What's going on, Sophia?" he asked, his voice gentle but insistent. Sophia opened her mouth to speak, but the words felt lodged in her throat. She had rehearsed this moment countless times in her mind, imagining every possible reaction from David. None of those rehearsals prepared her for the raw fear she felt now. "I haven't been honest with you," she began, her voice trembling. About how I've been feeling, about us. David's face softened, and he reached out to place a hand on hers. "It's okay," he said. "We can work through this. Whatever it is." Sophia's stomach twisted at his kindness. She didn't deserve it, not after what she'd done. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she needed to say next. "I've been seeing someone," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not just seeing, but I've been with someone else." The words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. For a moment, David didn't react. His hand remained on hers, but his grip loosened as her confession sank in. "What do you mean?" he asked, his tone quiet, almost disbelieving. "I mean exactly what I said," Sophia replied, tears brimming in her eyes. "I've been having an affair." David withdrew his hand, leaning back in his chair as if the distance might help him process her words. His face, usually so composed, was a storm of emotions: hurt, confusion, anger. "With who?" he asked after a long pause. Sophia hesitated, knowing that revealing Liam's identity would only add fuel to the fire. "Someone I met recently," she said, her voice trembling. "It doesn't matter who." David let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his hair. "Doesn't matter?" he echoed. "You've been lying to me for months, and you think it doesn't matter?" Sophia flinched at the sharpness of his tone. "I know I hurt you," she said, her tears spilling over. "I never wanted to, but I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't." David stood abruptly, pacing the room as if the movement might help him make sense of her betrayal. "So, what now?" he asked, his voice rising. "Do you leave? Do I leave? Do we just pretend this didn't happen?" I don't know," Sophia admitted, her voice cracking. "I don't have all the answers, David. I couldn't keep living a lie." He stopped pacing and turned to face her, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and pain. "Was it worth it?" he asked. "Was he worth destroying everything we built?" Sophia's chest tightened at the question. "It wasn't about him," she said, her voice soft but firm. "It was about me, about finding a part of myself I thought I'd lost." David stared at her, his expression unreadable. "And what about us?" he asked. "Did you even try to find that part of yourself here with me?" His words cut deep, and Sophia felt the weight of her guilt pressing down on her. "I tried," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I felt invisible, David, like I was just going through the motions, and I didn't know how to fix it." The conversation continued late into the night, their voices rising and falling as they grappled with the enormity of what had happened. David demanded answers Sophia couldn't give, and Sophia struggled to explain emotions she barely understood herself. At some point, David stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. Sophia sat alone in the living room, the silence deafening. She knew she had shattered their marriage, and there was no guarantee it could be repaired. The next day, Sophia went to Liam's apartment, her heart heavy with the weight of what had transpired. When he opened the door and saw her tear-streaked face, he pulled her into his arms without a word. "I told him," she said, her voice muffled against his chest. "He knows everything." Liam held her tightly, his hands running soothingly over her back. "How did he take it?" he asked softly. "Not well," Sophia admitted, pulling back to look at him. "He's angry, hurt, and I don't blame him." "You are honest," Liam said, his voice steady. "That's more than most people can say." Sophia nodded, her tears spilling over again. "But I don't know what comes next, she said. I feel like I'm standing on the edge of a cliff, and I don't know if I'm supposed to jump or walk away. Liam cupped her face in his hands, his gaze unwavering. Whatever you decide, I'll be here, he said. But I need to know, what do you want, Sophia? Not what you think you should do. What do you want? The question hit her like a tidal wave, forcing her to confront the truth she had been avoiding. What did she want? Freedom? Forgiveness? A chance to start over? The answer was both simple and terrifying. I want to be happy, she said, her voice trembling, but I don't know what that looks like anymore. Liam nodded, his hands dropping to her shoulders. Then let's figure it out together. As the days passed, Sophia and David's lives fell into a strained silence. David stayed at a friend's house, giving them both space to process. Meanwhile, Sophia spent her days painting, pouring her emotions onto the canvas in a desperate attempt to make sense of them. Liam was her constant, offering support without pressure. But even his presence couldn't ease the ache of the life she had left behind. The weight of her decisions was inescapable, and the path ahead felt impossibly uncertain. One evening, as she stood before a half-finished painting, her phone buzzed. It was a message from David. "We need to talk." Sophia stared at the screen, her heart racing. She knew the conversation that awaited her would be one of the hardest she had ever faced. But she also knew it was necessary. Taking a deep breath, she typed her reply. I'll be here." Sophia sat at the dining table, the space feeling colder and emptier than she ever remembered. The faint hum of the refrigerator was the only sound as she waited for David to arrive. Her fingers nervously traced the rim of her coffee cup, her mind replaying their argument over and over. When the door finally opened, David stepped inside, his face weary but composed. He set his keys on the counter and sat across from her. "I don't know where to start," he admitted, his voice breaking the heavy silence. "Neither do I," Sophia replied, her voice trembling, "but I think we need to figure out where we go from here." David leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his hands clasped tightly together. "Why didn't you come to me, Sophia? Why didn't you tell me you were unhappy?" Tears welled in her eyes as she struggled to find the words. "Because I didn't think it would matter," she said. "We've been drifting apart for so long, and I didn't know how to reach you." David's expression softened, the anger in his eyes replaced by sadness. "I can't pretend I didn't notice," he said. "But I didn't think it would come to this. I thought we were stronger than this." "I thought so too," Sophia said, her voice breaking. "But somewhere along the way, we stopped being a team, and I started feeling invisible." David sat back, his gaze fixed on the table. "I'm not perfect," he said. "I know I've been distant, but I loved you, Sophia. I still do. And I can't understand how you could let someone else into what we had." Sophia wiped a tear from her cheek, her heart aching at the raw emotion in his voice. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said, "but Liam made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. And I know that's not an excuse, it's just the truth." David shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. "So what now? Do you stay with him? Or do we try to fix this?" Sophia looked at him, her heart torn. "I don't know if we can fix this," she admitted. "I've broken something that might not be repairable." David nodded slowly, his face a mask of resignation. "Maybe you're right," he said. Maybe we've been broken for a long time, and we just didn't want to admit it. 2 weeks later, Sophia stood in her art studio, the smell of paint and turpentine filling the air. The walls were lined with vibrant canvases, each one a reflection of the emotional journey she had been on. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of purpose, a connection to herself she thought she'd lost. Liam walked in, a soft smile on his face. "You've been busy," he said, gesturing to the paintings. Sophia nodded, setting down her brush. "It helps," she said. "Even when everything feels overwhelming, this makes me feel like I'm in control." He stepped closer, his hand brushing hers. "I'm proud of you," he said, "for being honest, for choosing yourself." Sophia met his gaze, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I don't know what the future holds," she said, "but I know I want to keep exploring it. With you." Liam smiled, his hand tightening around hers. "We'll figure it out," he said, one step at a time. As they stood together in the quiet of the studio, Sophia felt a fragile sense of hope. Her life was far from perfect, and the scars of her choices would linger. But she had found a part of herself again, the part that longed for more, that refused to settle for less. It was a beginning, not an ending, and for now, that was enough.